900 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian position, the engineers and security officers stationed at Russia's Progress Rocket Space Center believed distance itself was a form of armor. Samara sat deep in Russia's industrial interior, ringed by air defense regiments, far outside what most Russian planners considered realistic range for anything Ukraine could build and launch in meaningful numbers. What the officers on shift that night did not know was that a small formation of missiles had already crossed into Russian airspace, that their approach had been timed against the known rotation schedule of a regional radar station, and that the flight path chosen for them had been selected weeks earlier not for its distance, but for its gaps. The building they were guarding was not a museum piece. It was Russia's only production line for the Soyuz, two-launch vehicle, the rocket family that had, for 2 decades, lifted Russian reconnaissance satellites, communications payloads, and crewed missions into orbit. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, the same assembly halls had taken on a second, quieter job, producing the launch infrastructure for Rassvet, Russia's answer to Starlink, a planned low-Earth orbit constellation, intended to give Russian forces the kind of resilient, hard-to-jam battlefield communications and reconnaissance relay that Ukraine's own access to Starlink had denied Moscow for the better part of 4 years. 2 buildings inside the complex, referred to internally by engineers as 106A and 106B rather than by any public name, handled final assembly and late-stage integration. One of them was about to stop existing in any useful sense. The missiles closing on Samara were Ukrainian-built FP-5 Flamingos long-range, jet-powered cruise missiles developed domestically by the Ukrainian firm Firepoint and shown publicly for the first time barely a year earlier. Each carried a warhead close to 1,100 kilograms, more than 3 times the payload of the Western-supplied cruise missiles Ukraine had relied on earlier in the war. And each was built around a stated range of up to 3,000 kilometers, enough to put nearly all of European Russia inside Ukraine's reach. Using a weapon Ukraine did not have to ask anyone's permission to fire. A Flamingo does not fly like a ballistic missile, arcing upward and dropping back down along a predictable curve that a fire control computer can calculate the moment it detects the launch flash. It flies low, slow by missile standards, and close to the terrain, using an inertial guidance system reinforced against satellite navigation, jamming a design choice that mattered enormously for what came next, because the single greatest weakness of a subsonic cruise missile has never really been its speed. It is the simple fact that, for most of its flight, someone with the right radar, watching the right patch of sky at the right moment, can in principle see it coming. At 0142 hours, the formation crossed into contested airspace at an altitude low enough to disappear into ground clutter on all but the most capable systems tracking that stretch of sky. This was not luck. It was geometry. Radar does not see over the horizon. The curvature of the Earth itself limits how far a ground-based system can detect a target flying near the surface. And every meter of altitude a cruise missile gives up is a kilometer or more of detection range it takes away from whoever is watching the screen. For the first several hundred kilometers of the flight, the missiles were, for practical purposes, invisible not because Russian radar coverage over the region was weak, but because the missiles were flying beneath what that radar could physically resolve. That changed as the formation crossed into the outer coverage envelope of a long-range S-400 battery screening the approaches to Samara Oblast's aerospace and defense industrial cluster. Here, the missiles became detectable briefly, and only in fragments, as terrain features repeatedly broke the radar's line of sight, and the tracks flickered rather than held steady. An S-400 system can, on paper, engage targets at ranges measured in hundreds of kilometers, but a fragmented, intermittent track is a poor foundation for committing an interceptor worth several $1 million to a shot that might simply miss a target. The radar can barely hold on to. The operators on duty that night logged the contacts, classified them as probable low-altitude cruise missiles, and passed the track onward to units better positioned to finish the engagement. No interceptor left an S-400 launcher that hour. The gauntlet's first wall had been crossed without a single shot fired in response. It helped, considerably, that Samara was not the only place demanding Russian attention that night. Ukrainian long-range assets were also inbound toward the Savaslyka airfield, home to MiG-31 interceptors carrying Kinzhal missiles, and toward fuel-handling infrastructure at the Baltic port of Ust-Luga, more than 1,500 kilometers away, in almost the opposite direction. 3 separate regions, 3 separate air defense commands, all reporting credible inbound threats inside the same narrow window, each one demanding the kind of full attention that leaves nothing left over for a fourth. Russia's integrated air defense network was not undermanned that night. It was outnumbered in the only sense that actually mattered in the number of genuinely difficult decisions its operators had to make correctly. At the same time, with incomplete information and no way of knowing which track in front of them was the one that counted most. A missile that cost a fraction of what a single satellite launch was worth had just been aimed at the one factory in the country that built the rocket, meant to carry that satellite into orbit, the tactical equivalent of torching the Beck printing press instead of spending years chasing down every bill it had already printed. 2 MiG-31 interceptors did eventually scramble from a base in the Volga military district, vectored toward the Samara approach corridor on the strength of that fragmented S-400 track. A MiG-31 is fast, capable of speeds well over Mach 2, but speed is not the same thing as the ability to find a small, low-flying, radar-quiet missile in the dark using an aircraft's own onboard radar, which has to look downward through the same ground clutter that had already defeated the system on the ground. The interceptors flew their assigned patrol geometry, working infrared search and track alongside radar in the hope of catching a heat signature against the cold night sky over the Volga. By the time either aircraft had built a workable picture of the airspace ahead of it, the formation had already passed beneath their patrol altitude and continued on toward the city lights of Samara. Of 6 missiles in the package, Russian air defense channels would later claim to have intercepted 2 somewhere along the approach corridor. 4 Flamingos remained inbound, and the distance left to cover was now measured in minutes, not hundreds of kilometers. The last line of defense belonged to the plant itself, a Pantsir S-1 system, positioned specifically to protect a high-value industrial site from exactly this kind of attack, combining short-range guided missiles with twin autocannons for point-blank engagement of exactly the sort of slow, low target a Flamingo represents in its final seconds. Pantsir is a genuinely difficult system to beat at close range against something large and comparatively slow. Against a cruise missile correcting its terminal approach in the last moments before impact, arriving low and from an unexpected bearing, its reaction window collapses to a matter of seconds rather than minutes. The system engaged. One of the 4 inbound Flamingos broke apart short of the perimeter fence, torn open by Pantsir fire in what plant security would later describe, almost proudly, as a successful intercept. It is not clear, even now, exactly how many rounds were fired at the other 3, or whether any of them found their mark. What is clear is that a point defense system built specifically to stop this outcome only partially did its job. At 0211 hours, the first warhead detonated against Building 106A, the primary final assembly hall for the Soyuz 2 program. The second struck seconds later, closer to the structure workers called 106B, used for late-stage integration of completed rocket sections. The third overshot the assembly halls entirely and came down on open ground near a parking apron north of the complex, scattering debris but doing little else. 2 hits were enough. 1,100 kilograms of warhead, twice over, inside a building full of precision tooling, partially assembled rocket stages, and specialized equipment that Russia could not simply reorder from a domestic supplier under the weight of years of sanctions. The fire that followed burned for hours, visible enough that residents across the district were posting footage before regional officials had said a single word. Local authorities would confirm only that an industrial facility had been struck, declining, as they nearly always did, to name it. They did not need to. Independent Russian channels had already worked out the target from the geometry of the smoke alone, and by morning, it was one of the worst-kept secrets in the region. The immediate structural damage mattered less than what it delayed. Soyuz 2 is not simply a civilian workhorse rocket. It is the vehicle Russia depends on to loft its military reconnaissance satellites, and increasingly, the early hardware for Rassvet, the constellation, meant to give Russian forces something closer to the persistent, jam-resistant battlefield communications, and targeting data that Ukraine's own access to Starlink had provided it for years. A damaged assembly line does not simply resume production once the fire is extinguished. The specialized jigs, fixtures, and partially completed rocket stages destroyed inside 106A cannot be replaced on short notice. And much of the precision machining equipment involved was never designed to be rebuilt under an active sanctions regime that has already forced Russian industry to improvise, substitute, and wait. Every month that assembly line stayed idle was a month Rassvet's timeline slipped further to the right, and a month longer that Russian units in the field kept fighting with the satellite picture they already had, not the one Moscow had promised them. Ukraine did not need to destroy Russia's future satellite network outright to disrupt it. It needed only to reach the one building, 900 kilometers from the nearest Ukrainian soldier, where that network was still being built, and to do it before 3 separate air defense commands, spread across 3 regions, could agree on which of that night's threats deserved to be taken most seriously. The missiles that reached Samara were not the fastest weapons in Ukraine's arsenal, nor the most numerous ever launched in a single night. They arrived low, quiet, and almost unnoticed, through gaps in a defensive network that had been mapped long before the first missile ever left its launch position. That, more than any single warhead, was the real weapon used against Samara that night, the patient exploitation of exactly how much a country the size of Russia can watch at once, and exactly how little of it, in the end, it actually managed to see. If you think the more consequential target that night was the rocket plant in Samara, or the airfield at Savasleika struck in the same wave of attacks, say which one and why in the comments below. If you want more breakdowns like this one, reconstructing exactly how a single strike unfolds system by system, consider subscribing to the channel. Peace for Ukraine, and let us hope wars like this come to an end soon. Goodbye.